Our investigation begins in the United Kingdom in 2019, centered on a man named Joseph McCann, who was born in London, England, on February 8, 1985. He was the middle of three brothers. Their father's family hailed from Scotland, while their mother came from an Irish traveler background. His older brother Sean was 2 years his senior, and the youngest, Michael, was 2 years his junior. For most of their childhood, the McCann boys were raised solely by their mother, growing up without a significant male figure in their lives. The family eventually moved from London to Manchester, where they were given a council house in the city's East End. Their new home was on the Beswick Council Estate, a place locals grimly called the Land of the Forgotten. Life for the boys was chaotic, defined by a constant state of flux and regular run-ins with crime. Joseph's education was just as turbulent, as he was shuffled from one school to another, never finding a stable or supportive learning environment. Details about his early years are scarce, but the records that do exist consistently point to a pattern of delinquency that spiraled into more serious criminal acts. The story of this case starts with Joseph terrorizing a single neighborhood and culminates in a manhunt across the entire country. For one of Britain's most wanted men, Joseph's descent into crime started early. By the time he was just 11, he and his brothers had already earned a dark reputation throughout the Beswick estate. Even though they were young and small, they managed to terrify their neighbors, creating a climate of fear and intimidation wherever they went. They would single out younger children on their way to homework clubs or just walking down the street, robbing them of their possessions. They also menaced the area's elderly population, making many of them too frightened to even leave their homes to pick up their pensions. In 1996, Joseph had his first formal encounter with the law when he was brought in on suspicion of theft. While the details of the incident are murky, we know that no charges were filed. In the 2 years that followed, complaints from residents started piling up. The brothers were routinely seen damaging cars, torching them, and shattering their windows. Their crimes grew to include muggings and later escalated to carjacking and driving without a license. The sheer devastation these boys unleashed upon their community was staggering. Countless adults became prisoners in their own homes, too terrified to venture outside. Some locals later admitted they would just stand by their windows and watch, as the boys committed one crime after another. Neighbors reported that the gang would break into vacant houses and strip them of their boilers right before new families were scheduled to move in. The brothers frequently hit local shops operating with complete impunity. They made no effort to hide their actions. They would simply enter a store and take whatever they pleased. They started recruiting other kids to join their destructive crusade, but Joseph always stood out as the pack's ringleader. Unbeknownst to them, however, a group of 5 fed-up residents had begun secretly documenting their aggressive behavior and criminal exploits. In time, this information reached the local council, which then started to build a formal case to put an end to their reign of terror. It was not a quick process, but council officials eventually installed surveillance cameras to gather irrefutable proof. The footage caught the boys in the act of destroying more vehicles, defacing property, and even throwing bricks at city workers. One photograph of the brothers jumping on top of a car was so striking it made the front page of the local paper. By 1998, with Joseph being just 13, their long list of transgressions was officially deemed a violation of their housing agreement. Consequently, their family home was promptly taken back by the Manchester City Council. On top of that, Joseph received his first criminal conviction for shoplifting. Regrettably, this conviction did not lead to time in a youth facility or any kind of rehabilitation program. Instead, the McCann family was moved to another estate about 2 miles away known as Ardwick. But relocating the McCann brothers did nothing to curb their destructive habits back in Beswick. They would just hop on a bus or steal a couple of bikes and head right back to their old territory. Then, in 1999, Home Secretary Jack Straw rolled out the new antisocial behavior, order to deal with public nuisances. This legal tool was created to combat issues like harassment, public intoxication, and violence by individuals and families through civil injunctions instead of criminal convictions. These were known as ASBOs. The McCann brothers became some of the very first individuals in the country to be served with these orders. The order forbade them from using or partaking in any abusive, insulting, hostile, threatening, or intimidating speech or actions anywhere in public within the city of Manchester. The case garnered national media attention. Yet, as the McCann brothers walked out of the courthouse, they struck a defiant pose for the press photographers, sporting massive grins on their faces. They brazenly gave the two-fingered salute to the cameras as if to declare that the day's legal proceedings had accomplished nothing. After this incident, the McCann family moved back to London. From his new base, Joseph went on to commit another 11 offenses that spanned across Norfolk, Hertfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and back to Manchester. His criminal activity had now intensified, now including weapons possession, reckless driving, and robbery. And as he aged out of the juvenile system, he lost the protections afforded to minors, which led directly to his arrest on July 29, 2004. A judge handed him a 62-month prison sentence. During his time inside, prison officials intercepted 2 letters containing deeply disturbing and explicit material. One of the letters detailed his intentions, an immaculate young woman upon his return to society. The correspondence exposed a conspiracy with his relatives, tasking them with procuring a suitable girl before he was set free. A second letter was dispatched to his case officer, the very individual responsible for evaluating his potential to reoffend. This note contained an explicit promise of violence against the officer. That same year, 2007, while he was still incarcerated, his girlfriend delivered his firstborn son. For many inmates, such an event would be the ultimate motivation to reform. After serving 38 months, he was freed on the 13th of September, 2007. He showed almost no interest in meeting his new child or reconnecting with his partner. Joseph was granted parole, a status indicating he was no longer considered a public danger, and could finish his sentence within the community, subject to a stringent set of guidelines. It appears, however, that a significant error occurred at the National Probation Service. The letters revealing Joseph's violent intentions toward his case officer were never brought up during his parole hearing. This mistake would remain buried for several years. Following his release, Joseph settled in Bedford under the watch of a different probation officer than the one he had targeted. This new officer was charged with ensuring Joseph adhered to his parole conditions, with the authority to have him sent back to prison for any violation. Predictably, on the 2nd of November, 2007, Joseph did just that. While the specifics of the breach are unknown, a warrant was issued for his immediate return to custody. Joseph chose to become a fugitive. He became a fugitive on the 27th of December, 2007. At just 23 years old, Joseph decided to target a residence in Colm End, near Bedford, the home of a vulnerable 85-year-old man. Joseph coldly threatened the man with a knife, warning he would stab him in the eye if he didn't hand over his money. With no other option, the man gave him his wallet, avoiding a violent confrontation. When the crime was reported, police immediately suspected Joseph was the culprit. On January 15, 2008, CCTV footage captured Joseph in the Bedford area, close to the scene of the crime. Officers located and arrested him for aggravated burglary and for violating the terms of his license. Joseph pleaded guilty to the aggravated burglary and awaited his sentence. On the 26th of September, 2008, Joseph expressed deep shame for his actions. He stated his new ambition was to lead a law-abiding life, lamenting that his prior prison term had caused him to miss the birth of his first child. At this time, his partner was expecting their second child. After weighing all the facts, the judge classified Joseph as a dangerous individual. He received an indeterminate sentence for public protection with a minimum term of 13 months, which is functionally similar to a life sentence. This meant the parole board could only grant his release if they were confident the threat he posed could be safely managed within society. Fulfilling the minimum term was no guarantee of freedom. In 2009, Joseph once again began writing letters to friends and family, filling them with graphic, violent, and sexually explicit details. The correspondence was flagged to his offending manager, who subsequently assessed him as posing a high risk to the public. Joseph's application for parole in 2010 was denied. As his 13-month minimum term neared its end in 2011, he applied once more. However, it was during this period that his letters from 2003 came to light. Unsurprisingly, his application was once again denied in 2012. By 2014, Joseph had served almost twice his minimum term, but the parole board remained unconvinced he was genuinely committed to changing. In that time, he had assaulted other inmates. He was caught with contraband and bladed weapons, and he had even made an escape attempt. Consequently, he was moved to a different prison. For the McCann brothers, this was a grimly familiar pattern. His older brother, Sean, was serving a 2-year sentence for assault. On the 13th of March, 2016, Sean took his own life. Sean had struggled with mental health issues and had attempted suicide twice in the preceding weeks. It later emerged that the prison service had failed to implement the correct safety protocols. His death was preventable. The family, Joseph included, was left devastated and enraged. In an effort to persuade authorities that he could be safely released, Joseph McCann enrolled in several rehabilitation courses. They covered cognitive skills, victim awareness, and how to build healthy relationships. For his rehabilitation, he was moved to Wymont Prison in Lancashire, a specialized unit designed for inmates with complex behavioral issues, including personality disorders. By the time of his 4th parole hearing, both probation and prison staff noted a significant improvement in Joseph's behavior. As a result, he was released in March of 2017, but with a strict condition that he first reside in an approved facility. He was subject to a curfew, mandatory drug screenings, and was required to notify officials about any new relationships. And just like before, he was put back on license. Any misstep would land him right back behind bars. After completing his stay at the approved premises, he was permitted to return to Buckinghamshire. There, he resided with a few of his relatives. But by July of 2018, Joseph began drifting between different addresses in Manchester and Hertfordshire. Because of this, his offending manager lost contact with him, a clear violation of his license conditions. It wouldn't be long before he reoffended. On the 18th of August, 2017, Joseph and an associate broke into a house, took the car keys, and made off with 2 BMWs. He was eventually captured and convicted of both car theft and burglary. In January of 2018, his sentence was 3 years and 4 months in prison. The presiding judge knew that he had violated the license from his previous sentence. The judge ordered that the new sentence and the old one he was on license for would be served concurrently. But through a series of administrative blunders in a catastrophic failure, Joseph was released after serving only half of his sentence. After 18 months, on February 15, 2019, Joseph was free, having spent nearly all his time since 2003 incarcerated, with less than a year of freedom. He was a clear danger to the public, and his release would only give him the opportunity to inflict more suffering. This time, however, his crimes were about to escalate. They would reach a level that would cement Joseph's reputation as one of Britain's most dangerous criminals. Upon his release, he had one specific condition to follow. He was forbidden from starting any new relationships with women. In direct defiance of this rule, Joseph started seeing a new partner, and together they applied for social housing. Their housing application was denied, but the attempt itself alerted the authorities that he had entered into a new relationship. He had done so without informing his offending manager. When the manager discovered this, the response was merely a warning letter sent on the 10th of April. This was followed by a face-to-face meeting on the 18th of April. Authorities were well aware that Joseph posed a threat to women, yet they failed to take decisive action. In the days that followed, Joseph would show the world just how dangerous he was, and still is, while exposing the grave failings of the National Probation Service. It began on the 21st of April, 2019, at 3:30 a.m. Joseph spotted a young woman walking alone on a street in Watford, North London. The 21-year-old was heading home after a night out. Joseph accosted her, demanding she get into his car. He shoved her inside, threatening to stab her if she resisted. He also warned he would strike her if she didn't stop crying. As he drove, Joseph bizarrely accused the woman, whom he called Hi, of hurting his younger sister. Joseph pulled into a library parking lot and told the terrified woman that men were on their way to assault her for what she had supposedly done. It was a twisted attempt at manipulation. He told her the only way to avoid the beating was if he could tell the men she had slept with him and used illegal drugs. He then forced her to undress. He took pictures of her, all while claiming he had a gun. Eventually, Joseph drove the young woman back to where he had abducted her and let her get her bag. In a desperate bid to end the ordeal, she showed him her driver's license to prove her name wasn't High, but this act only escalated things. She disclosed her address. Seizing the opportunity, Joseph drove her to the location, took her inside, and attacked her in the sanctity of her own bed. He threatened her over and over, warning her about the knife he was carrying and making it clear he wouldn't hesitate to use it if she fought back. After it was over, Joseph finally released her and vanished from the house. For more than 5 hours, the terrified woman endured a nightmarish ordeal, held captive and subjected to a relentless series of attacks. Authorities were alerted, and the victim was taken for the standard forensic examination required after such a violation. The problem was, this was Joseph McCann's first documented assault of this nature, meaning his genetic profile wasn't in any official database. While investigators launched a manhunt for the unknown attacker, Joseph remained free, determined to continue his rampage of absolute terror. In the early hours of April 25, 2019, a 25-year-old woman was making her way home on foot through North London after finishing a late shift at work. Joseph ambushed her, grabbing her head and muffling her screams with his hand, threatening to stab her if she made a sound. He then violently pulled the helpless woman into his car and sped away. What she endured next was an act of unspeakable brutality. Joseph subjected her to repeated and comprehensive violations. The assault continued as Joseph beat her with his fists, at one point threatening to smash a vodka bottle he was drinking over her head. He then compelled the woman to engage in numerous degrading acts. He forced her to urinate on him before he urinated into her mouth, making her swallow it. Joseph's final threat was to force her to consume his own feces. The ordeal was unimaginable, stretching on for a grueling 14 hours as Joseph relentlessly tormented the woman before shoving her back into his car. He then drove to a school with his captive beside him and chillingly remarked that he wanted to find someone. He then assaulted the victim a second time, warning her that he would end her life and dispose of her body in the canal, where all forensic evidence would be eliminated. He further vowed to hold her captive indefinitely, with no chance of ever being freed, before paradoxically taking her through a McDonald's drive-thru. Surveillance footage confirmed Joseph was driving around with his captive when he targeted his next victims, a 21-year-old woman and her 18-year-old sister who were walking in North London. Pulling his vehicle alongside them, Joseph violently abducted the 21-year-old, forcing her into the car where his first 25-year-old victim was already being held. While his effort to capture the younger sister failed, the newly abducted 21-year-old was then subjected to a horrific 2-hour-long assault. Joseph also coerced the two captives into performing acts with one another, silencing any protest by threatening to cut their throats and hurl them into the river. When the 21-year-old explained that she was a virgin because of her religious convictions, he beat her into submission until she stripped off her clothes. He put her through the same degrading acts he had inflicted on the first victim, and with both women secured in his vehicle, Joseph made his way to a hotel. Security cameras at the location recorded him trying to rent a room, his clear intention being to continue the assaults in a more private setting. His greeting was a vodka bottle shattered against his skull. Seizing the opportunity, the two women bolted from the vehicle, sprinting toward a group of construction workers across the street. Joseph pursued them, but the presence of the construction crew forced him to abandon the chase. The women had finally escaped their captor in a stroke of incredible luck. Their freedom, however, spelled disaster for the next individuals Joseph would target. Once authorities were notified, they immediately identified Joseph as the likely perpetrator. A 20,000-pound bounty was issued for any intelligence on his location, sparking a massive manhunt. In an attempt to evade capture, Joseph fled north to Manchester. There, on May 5, 2019, he would carry out his final string of offenses. During the pre-dawn hours, Joseph zeroed in on an extremely inebriated mother of two inside a pub. The suspect convinced the woman to share a taxi, presenting it as a safety measure. Upon arrival at her residence, he exited the cab with her. His true targets, however, were not the mother, but her children. Joseph accompanied the woman inside, and by 7 a.m., he had restrained her to the bed with electrical wiring. He then moved into the adjoining room and confronted her 17-year-old daughter. The subsequent assault was carried out in front of her 11-year-old brother. Following his established pattern, he then violated the teenage girl. It was a profoundly disturbing assault. Forced the boy to engage in heinous acts with him for 3 hours and 20 minutes. In a stunning act of defiance, the 17-year-old girl seized an opportunity, leaping naked from an upstairs window to escape. The impact shattered both her heels, but she successfully found someone to help. This desperate move spooked Joseph, allowing him to slip away yet again. By 1:30 p.m., 3 hours later, he had vanished. In a Greater Manchester supermarket parking lot, a woman of 71 had just returned to her vehicle after buying groceries. Joseph then got into her passenger seat, struck her in the face as hard as he could, and ordered her to drive. He menaced her, claiming to have a knife and alleging he had just taken someone's life. This began a terrifying 5-hour ordeal for the senior, who was held prisoner inside her own vehicle while he subjected her to physical and sexual abuse. About 2 hours into the abduction, at approximately 3:30, he compelled her to pull the vehicle over next to two 13-year-old boys, along with one young girl. He approached the trio with a fabricated story, alleging they had bullied his sister online, and demanded they get into the vehicle. The boys were let go almost immediately, but Joseph held the girl captive in a car driven by a 71-year-old woman. He then professed his love for the young victim, declaring that she was now his girlfriend. The assault began as he started kissing her and touching her underneath her clothing against her will. Later, forensic analysis would uncover traces of his male DNA on her pants. Joseph then directed the woman to stop at a nearby service station, where onlookers intervened, allowing the elderly driver and the child to get away. Joseph immediately commandeered the elderly woman's vehicle and sped off. Within just 30 minutes, he had ingested an illicit substance and consumed more alcohol. Later on, he targeted his next and final victims. While on the road, Joseph caught sight of two 14-year-old girls and pulled up alongside them, coercing them into the car. He confronted the two girls, employing his usual intimidation methods. He berated them for supposedly tormenting his sister and then threatened to end their lives if the harassment didn't cease. After getting into the vehicle, he briefly stopped at a gas station for condoms and then continued on. What he didn't know was that law enforcement now had eyes on his car, which they identified as a Fiat Punto registered to his previous victim, an elderly woman. Officers quickly located the vehicle, but a sense of dread washed over them when they saw two young girls in the back. A high-speed pursuit immediately began. Joseph drove recklessly, veering into oncoming traffic and colliding with a Mercedes at a traffic circle. The chase continued into a housing complex, where he crashed the vehicle a second time and bolted on foot. Miraculously, neither of the girls was injured in the collisions. This triggered a massive 9-hour manhunt for Joseph across the entire area. Authorities set up roadblocks, and Joseph nearly slipped through one by attempting to pass through in a taxi, posing as an intoxicated man leaving a pub with a pint glass still in his hand. The officers at the checkpoint saw through his ruse and asked him to lift his t-shirt, as they knew the suspect had a telltale tattoo on his stomach. The instant the officer made the request, Joseph fled as fast as his legs could carry him. He darted down a rural lane nearby and scrambled up a tree to hide. His cowardly attempt to conceal himself was short-lived. Police spotted him quickly. With the help of a cause negotiator, authorities coaxed Joseph down and took him into custody to answer for his horrific actions. The capture of Joseph McCann brought an end to a rampage that had terrorized 11 victims. His wave of offenses had lasted for 15 days. During his trial, many of the survivors courageously took the stand, determined to see him imprisoned for life. The impact statements from the survivors detailed the profound and lasting trauma he inflicted. One woman recounted how the life she had known was completely destroyed. Another testified that he had violently ripped away all her hopes and dreams for the future, both large and small. In general, the survivors now live with daily trauma that has profoundly crippled their capacity to work, sleep, socialize, or simply lead a normal life. Several were forced to move away from the homes they had once cherished. Joseph was ultimately found guilty. At his sentencing, the judge delivered several powerful statements describing the man as a classic psychopath, exceptionally dangerous, and a violent bully. Not once during the trial did Joseph show a shred of remorse. When it was time to finally face his victims in court, he claimed he was unable to attend due to poor cell conditions and a lack of sleep. True to his pattern of mindless criminality, he displayed a total lack of empathy for anyone else, a trait that will likely never change. On the 9th of December, 2019, Joseph was found guilty on 37 distinct criminal counts, including rape, sexual assault, and false imprisonment. His punishment consisted of 33 life sentences to run concurrently, plus a determinate term of 45 years, making him eligible for parole in 30 years. However, on the 11th of December, 2020, Solicitor General Michael Ellis QC filed an appeal against the 30-year minimum term handed to Joseph McCann. This was part of a broader appeal by the Solicitor General, who also challenged similar 30-year minimums for other dangerous offenders, like Rurik Jutting. He petitioned the court to increase these minimum sentences to 40 years, a motion that was ultimately successful. Consequently, Joseph McCann's non-parole period was extended from 30 years to 40 years, which means he is guaranteed to stay locked up well into his 70s. The case of Joseph McCann is a story of pure evil, and one can only pray that any future requests he makes for parole are firmly denied.